Hi class, so today we are going to be starting our life science unit with our first set of notes that will help give you some background information in order to come up with a final product for your STEM project that is awesome. So our first I can statement that we're going to focus on is comparing producers and consumers, which also means that we need to compare processes that are very important to both of them, and that is photosynthesis and respiration. So last year you also learned about life science, but you were studying things that were smaller than what we're going to be studying this year. And so you started off talking about atoms, which we also discussed at the beginning of this year, and how they're the building blocks of all matter, whether it's living or non-living matter. And then you talked about how atoms make up little bit larger things, which are called cell organelles. And examples of those might be like mitochondria or chloroplast, but those are a couple examples of a cell organelle. And then cell organelles combine to kind of build up what we call a cell. And a cell is consists of many cell organelles that do different functions that make the cell be able to thrive. And when we have a group of cells that have the same function and are grouped together in an area, that makes up a tissue. And tissues combine to form organs within living things. And lastly, you studied that organs are part of organ systems. So, for example, the heart is an organ that is part of the circulatory system. And so where are we going with this year? Well, we're going to study the thing that kind of comes after this in this little hierarchy of living pieces of matter. And we are going to be talking about the organism. And there are two different types of organisms. I think you see on your notes how there is a chart. And in that chart, you see that there are two boxes beside the word organism. Let me just look at that real quick. So if I go to your notes, organism is already filled in, and so you're going to be filling in the two types of organisms. And one type, and you'll see at the bottom of the screen, is a producer, and the other is a consumer. And I want you to make sure that you write producer at the top of the chart and consumer at the bottom. But you also just need to know what an organism is, and so feel free to take notes around the word organism in this chart. It is a living thing, and an organism can be unicellular or multicellular, but and that just means made up of one cell or made up of many cells. And all living organisms need food, water, and shelter to survive. And keep in mind that when we say shelter here, we're not necessarily just talking about like a home or a place to get cover. We're also talking about climate and what kind of temperatures and seasons and precipitation would be best for this organism to thrive and survive. Okay, so let's talk first about producer, which is one of the types of organisms. It is defined as a living organism that can make its own food. So you're familiar with these things, they're plants. What's interesting about them is that all other organisms depend on producers. If there are not plants, then other things cannot survive. All right, so producers defined by making their own food. We have to talk about the process that they do this. Photosynthesis is the process, and what you need to understand is when we say food, sometimes this is called glucose, and that is just sugar that's made by plants, and that helps them have the energy to survive. Sunlight is very important in this process. It is the energy source that allows this process to take place. And we're going to talk about that a little bit further. Also in your notes, it asks you to put down some cell organelles that are responsible for each process. And you want to put down that chloroplasts contain chlorophyll, which collect the sunlight. And that energy that's collected from the sunlight is then used to break down water and carbon dioxide. All right, so plant uses the glucose it makes to create starch, or what we might better know as carbohydrates. And then we eat, we as in humans, as well as some other animals, eat the plants, and therefore we get those carbohydrates as well as the vitamins that are stored within the plant through that process that it goes through. So you'll notice that on your notes, and I'm going to click back to your notes real quick just to make sure that you're on the right page. So we have already filled in the first two blocks here to the right of organisms. And we have already filled in the top part of this chart. You should have photosynthesis, the purpose of this, what is the purpose of this process, and that's to create food, specifically glucose for the plant. And then only producers go through this process, and then we have a little bit about the cell organelle of chloroplast and its job in this process. And so what you want to do now is go to the next page. And here you'll see that we have a top box that we're going to write the equation down. So I'm going to flip back over here, and I want you to record the equation. 6 carbon dioxide plus 6 water plus sunlight. Then place the arrow that you see in on this presentation. Then you're going to write C6H12O6. And I think it's important that you note below there, it tells you that that is the chemical symbol for glucose. Plus 6O2, which is oxygen gas, and thermal energy. So now that you have the equation written down, we need to look underneath the equation, and you're going to see 2 boxes on your notes. And those 2 boxes have you kind of think about the 2 sides of the equation. And to the left of the arrow that you had in the equation are the reactants. Those are the things that are needed to go through a chemical reaction and produce products. And so on the right side of the arrow are the products that exist. And what I want you to kind of think about is the energy or the law of conservation of energy and the law of conservation of matter as we're discussing this. But we are going to break down those chemical formulas that you have written down. And what I mean by that, I want you to look over here where you see the first molecule in the equation, which is carbon dioxide. And out in front of this molecule is the number 6. And so we know that there are going to be 6 carbon dioxide atoms, but we're going to break and see how many atoms this actually is of carbon and how many atoms this is of oxygen. The way we do this is because carbon does not have a number behind it, there is actually kind of like a ghost number 1. And so you're going to say 6 times 1 means there's a total of 6 carbons in those 6 carbon dioxide molecules. So under reactants in your chart, I want you to write 6 carbon atoms. Next, we're going to do the oxygens. Notice that there's a 2 here because for every carbon dioxide atom, there's 2 oxygens with every 1 carbon. But since there's a total of 6 carbon dioxide molecules, we have to multiply these numbers. So 6 times 2 will give us 12 oxygen atoms. So I want you to go ahead and write that down under reactants. Okay, looking over to the next molecule, we have water. Behind the H, which is hydrogen, there's a 2. So we multiply to find out how many total hydrogen atoms in those 6 water molecules, and it would be 12. So we have 12 hydrogen atoms. Next, we have oxygen. There's no number behind it, so we take 6 times 1, and we get 6 oxygen. But notice that we already wrote down oxygen under reactants. So we are going to add those on to the 12 that we already have in our chart. So under reactants of photosynthesis, you're going to have a total of 6 carbon atoms, 18 oxygen atoms, and 12 hydrogen atoms, plus sunlight, and that is the energy resource that enables this chemical reaction to happen within the plant. All right, let's move over to this side. So we're now on the product side of the equation. There is no number out in front, so this makes this a little bit easier. There are 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens. So take a minute and get all 3 of those written down. However, moving on, there are 6 oxygen gas molecules, and so what we want to do is take the 6, multiply it by the 2, and we have 12 more oxygen. So over here, we had already written 6 down in our box. We need to add on 12 more, which gives us a total of 18. Lastly, in that products box, we have thermal energy. And so that is the energy that is released through this that's not already in the bonds of these molecules. That's the energy that's released, and we'll be talking about that a little bit later. It's kind of like that dissipated energy coming off of the plant due to the process that it just went through. All right, so that was a lot of information. Let's just double check real quick. In your notes, you should have this complete box of photosynthesis filled out. And what you should notice is that the same amount of oxygen atoms over here are over here. Same with carbon, same with hydrogen. And lastly, there's energy at the start and there's energy at the end. So it's not destroyed in the process, it is just changed. So matter was changed by regrouping it. Energy was changed by being transformed. Okay, we're going to move on in our notes now. And I'm going to get back up to the presentation. All right. Consumers. This was the other type of organism that you need to record on that top hierarchy chart that we started with at the beginning of your notes. A consumer is something that feeds on other living things, including producers, but it might also be other consumers, okay? They cannot make their own food like plants can. Now you'll notice there are 4 other boxes next to consumers. Take a minute and record these 4 down. The first one is herbivores, and if you don't know what an herbivore is, you might want to write some information out to the side. Herbivores eat plants. Examples would be like a deer or a cow. Carnivores is another one. They eat other consumers. Instead of animals there, I should probably have consumers. Examples of those would be lions or cheetahs. And omnivores. Omnivores eat both plants and animals. Examples of that would be bears, pigs, and chimpanzees. Lastly, there are decomposers. They are the ones that break down dead material and waste in an ecosystem, but they break it down and they kind of return it back to the ecosystem to be reutilized by those primary producers, again, that we're going to be talking about in the future. So examples would be mushrooms, bacteria, those sorts of living things. All right. Cellular respiration is the second process. So this is a process. It's important that you understand what it does. Maybe you want to write this down. But it is when cells convert chemical energy that's stored in the sugars or the starches and carbs. So that is what was made from going through the process of photosynthesis. But cellular respiration is using those carbs and energy sources and turning it into what's called ATP, which becomes used